Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 disturbing stories from the small towns and backwoods of Georgia. These are tales of people who ventured into forgotten places and encountered something that defies explanation. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The town of Millhaven sits about 40 minutes south of Augusta, right where the pine forests start getting thick enough that you lose cell service if you drive too far down the wrong road. My Aunt Diane inherited a property out there in 2019, about 8 acres with a small house that hadn't been lived in since the early 90s. She asked if I'd go out there with her to assess what needed doing before she could even think about selling it. I just finished my second year of college and had nothing better to do that July, so I agreed. We drove out on a Thursday morning. I remember because I'd picked up breakfast biscuits from Hardee's and the receipt had the date on it, July 11th. The property was harder to find than we'd expected. The mailbox had fallen over years ago, and the driveway was so overgrown it looked like just another gap in the tree line. Diane had to check the GPS 3 times before we turned in. The house itself wasn't as bad as I'd feared. One-story, faded blue siding, a screened porch that sagged on one side. The yard was waist-high with weeds and wild onion. You could smell it in the heat, that sharp green smell mixed with pine sap and something else I couldn't place. Maybe stagnant water. There was supposed to be a creek somewhere on the property. We spent the first hour just walking around the outside, making notes. Diane was worried about the roof. I was more concerned about the number of wasp nests under the eaves. The windows were intact but filthy, and when you tried to look inside, all you could see was your own reflection and dark shapes beyond. Around 11, we finally opened the front door. The key stuck in the lock and Diane had to wiggle it for a solid minute before something gave. The door swung inward with a long creak that sounded exactly like you'd expect. Inside smelled like dust and mouse droppings and old fabric. Not terrible, just stale. Like opening a closet that hasn't been touched in decades. The layout was simple. Living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. Everything was still furnished. Whoever had lived here last had left in a hurry or maybe died and no one had bothered to clear things out. There was a floral couch with sunken cushions, a coffee table with old TV guide magazines from 1992, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. One of the bedroom doors was closed. The other stood open, showing a bare mattress on a metal frame. Diane started taking pictures with her phone for the insurance assessment. I wandered into the kitchen. The cabinets still had dishes in them, plain white plates, mismatched coffee mugs, a set of glasses with faded cartoon characters I didn't recognize. The refrigerator was unplugged and empty except for a box of baking soda that had turned into a solid brick. That's when I noticed the back door was ajar. Just an inch or two, like someone had closed it without latching it and the wind had pushed it open. Except there was no wind. The air inside the house was completely still and about 15 degrees hotter than outside. I walked over and pulled the door open wider. It led to a small back porch, just concrete steps and a wooden railing. Beyond that was more overgrown yard sloping down toward a line of trees. I could hear something back there, maybe the creek Diane had mentioned. A low trickling sound, very faint. "Find anything," Diane called from the living room. "Back door wasn't latched," I said. I stepped out onto the porch. The wood felt soft under my sneakers, spongy with rot. I made a mental note to tell Diane this whole section would need replacing. That's when I saw the footprints. They were in the dust on the porch floor, leading from the steps up to the back door. Bare feet. Adult-sized, narrow, with all 5 toes clearly visible. They were fresh. You could see where the dust had been disturbed in sharp, clean edges, not worn down or blown over. I crouched down to look closer. The prints tracked right up to the threshold and then stopped. None going back down the steps. None anywhere else on the porch, just coming up to the door and ending. My mouth went dry. I tried to tell myself someone had been here recently, squatters maybe, or kids messing around. But the prints looked wrong for that. They were too deliberate, too evenly spaced, and there was something about the way the toes spread that didn't look quite natural. Like someone walking on the balls of their feet, weight distributed strangely. Cameron, Diane's voice came from inside, closer now. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Just looking at the porch." I stood up quickly, not wanting to see those prints anymore. When I turned around, Diane was in the kitchen doorway, phone in hand. Behind her, I could see through to the living room, and that closed bedroom door was open now. I stared at it. I knew it had been closed. I'd seen it closed not 5 minutes ago. "Did you open that door?" I asked. Diane glanced back. "What door?" "The bedroom. It was closed before." She frowned. "I didn't touch it, must not have been latched either. Old houses settle weird." I nodded, but my skin was prickling. Houses settling didn't explain the footprints, didn't explain the feeling that was crawling up my spine, the sensation of being watched from somewhere I couldn't see. Diane went to check the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen, looking at that half-open back door, listening to the faint creak sound. Except now that I was really listening, it didn't sound quite like water. It was more rhythmic than that, more like breathing. I pulled the door shut firmly and turned the lock. It was an old brass deadbolt, stiff but functional. When I turned around, Diane was standing in the bedroom doorway with a strange expression. "There's something you should see," she said. The bedroom was dim even with the window. The curtains were drawn, heavy brown fabric that blocked most of the light. There was a double bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser, and a wooden chair facing the corner. That's what Diane was looking at. The wall in that corner was covered in writing. Pencil, pen, what might have been crayon. Words and phrases crammed together, overlapping, some so faded they were barely visible. I stepped closer, trying to read them. "Don't let it in. Stays by the creek. Only comes at night if you're alone. Pretends to be what you love." The thin one. There were more, dozens more, covering the wall from about waist height up to just above my head. The handwriting changed, sometimes shaky and childlike, sometimes precise block letters, sometimes frantic scrawls. Different people had written these, over years probably. "What the hell?" Diane whispered. I reached out to touch one of the phrases and my hand was shaking. The wall was cold under my fingers, much colder than it should have been. From somewhere outside I heard a sound. A soft thump like something stepping onto wood. Then another, slow, measured steps. Diane and I both turned toward the window at the same time. The curtains were closed, but there was a gap of about 2 inches where they didn't quite meet. Through that gap I could see a sliver of the backyard, the overgrown grass, the tree line. and something pale moving between the trees, too tall to be a person, with limbs that bent at joints that weren't quite right. It was moving parallel to the house, watching. I couldn't see a face. The angle was wrong, but I could see the way it moved. Smooth and deliberate, like it was gliding more than walking. Diane grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. She'd seen it too. The thing stopped. For maybe 10 seconds it just stood there at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by branches and shadow. Then it turned, and even though I still couldn't see its face clearly, I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking directly at the window, directly at us. "We need to leave," Diane said. Her voice was high and tight, barely controlled. "Right now." We didn't run. Some instinct told me running would be worse. But we moved fast through the house, past the furniture and the dust and that awful closed-in smell. I pulled the front door shut behind us. It took 3 tries to get the key into the lock because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The rental car was parked where we'd left it, blazing hot from sitting in the sun. Diane started it with fumbling hands while I watched the corner of the house, waiting to see if that pale thing would come around from the back. It didn't, but as we pulled out of the overgrown driveway, I looked in the side mirror. There was someone standing at the edge of the yard, tall and colorless and perfectly still, watching us leave. It raised one arm too long with too many joints and held it there. We drove in silence for 20 minutes before either of us spoke. Diane pulled over at a gas station in Sylvania, and we sat in the parking lot while she called a realtor. She listed the property that same week, sold it as is to some investor from Atlanta who planned to bulldoze it for timber land. I never asked her what she thought she saw. She never asked me. But 2 weeks later, a padded envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a photograph, one of the ones Diane had taken with her phone that day. It showed the kitchen, the white cabinets, the cartoon glasses, and in the reflection of the window above the sink, blurred but unmistakable, was a pale shape standing on the back porch, looking in. A story too. I worked for a regional power company based out of Valdosta for about 3 years, mostly doing meter readings and service checks in rural areas. The job was fine, lots of driving, minimal supervision, decent pay for what it was. Most of the places I visited were normal enough. Trailers, farmhouses, the occasional cabin. You'd knock, confirm the reading, and leave. In March of 2021, I got assigned to check a property outside a town called Enigma. The name always made me laugh. It's a real place, maybe 300 people, right in the middle of farm country. The work order said the property owner had called about inconsistent power delivery, lights flickering, that sort of thing. Probably just a loose connection somewhere. The address took me about 15 miles outside town, down a county road that turned to gravel and then to dirt. I was driving a company truck, white Ford with the logo on the side, and by the time I found the turnoff, the truck was covered in red dust. The property was set back from the road maybe a quarter mile. Just a single wide trailer, white with rust stains, sitting in a clearing surrounded by pines and live oaks. There was a satellite dish on the roof, a propane tank on one side, and a burn barrel that looked like it got used regularly. No cars visible, no lights on inside, though it was only about 2 in the afternoon. I parked near the front steps and grabbed my clipboard. The meter was around back, I could see the service line running from the pole, so I walked around the trailer, boots crunching on dead leaves and pine needles. That's when I noticed the smell. Sour and organic, like rotting vegetation mixed with something metallic. It was coming from the woods behind the property where the trees grew denser. I'd smelled plenty of dead animals in my time doing this work, and this was similar but not quite the same. Heavier, almost sweet. The meter was fine. Numbers where they should be, connections tight, no visible damage. I made a note and was about to head back to the truck when I heard the voice. "You from the power company?" I turned around. A woman was standing at the corner of the trailer, maybe 50 years old, thin to the point of gauntness, wearing a house dress that had seen better days. I hadn't heard her come out, hadn't heard a door open or close. "Yes, ma'am," I said, putting on my professional voice. "Just checking your meter. Everything looks good on this end. The issue might be internal. You might want to check your breaker box." She didn't respond right away, just looked at me with eyes that seemed too large for her face. Dark eyes, unblinking. "You seen anything back there?" She gestured toward the woods. "Back where?" "In the trees, past the clearing." I glanced over my shoulder. The woods looked normal to me. Thick underbrush, pine shadows, that weird Georgia stillness you get on hot afternoons when even the birds go quiet. "No, ma'am, just checked the meter." She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she already knew. "It comes around sometimes, usually at night, but sometimes during the day too if it's cloudy." I had no idea what to say to that. You get used to odd conversations in this line of work. People who are lonely, people who are paranoid, people who just want someone to talk to. I defaulted to polite and non-committal. "Well, your power should be stable now. If you have any more issues, just give the office a call." "Don't go back there," she said. Her voice had changed, gotten lower. "If you're smart, you won't go back there." I nodded and made my way back to the truck, feeling her eyes on me the entire time. When I got to the driver's side door, I looked back. She was still standing there at the corner of the trailer, perfectly motionless, watching me. I got in and started to pull away. But as I turned the truck around, my headlights swept across the tree line. I'd instinctively turned them on even though it was daylight. Something about the shadows under those trees made me want more visibility, and I saw something that made me stop. There was a path, not a hiking trail or anything maintained, just a narrow gap in the underbrush where something had pushed through repeatedly enough to make a clear route. And hanging from the low branches on either side of that path were objects. Strips of cloth, pieces of rope, what might have been small bones. They hung perfectly still in the windless air. I should have left. I knew I should have left. But something about those objects bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. They weren't random. They were deliberately placed, evenly spaced like markers. I put the truck in park and got out. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity. Maybe just that stubborn part of my brain that refuses to accept something is wrong until it's definitively proven. The path led away from the trailer toward a section of woods that looked darker than the rest. Older trees maybe, or just denser canopy. I walked slowly, checking the ground for snakes or holes, but mostly watching those hanging objects. Up close, they were worse. The cloth strips had symbols drawn on them in what looked like dried mud. Circles, spirals, stick figures with too many limbs. The rope pieces had knots tied in patterns that hurt to look at somehow, and the bones were definitely bones. Small ones, bird skulls, squirrel jawbones, things with tiny teeth. The path curved and I followed it maybe 30 yards into the woods. The smell was stronger here, that sweet rot odor that made my eyes water. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and kept walking. The path ended at a clearing, a perfect circle, maybe 15 feet across, where nothing grew. Just bare dirt packed hard with a small depression in the center, and scattered around that depression were more bones, bigger this time. I'm not an expert, but some of them looked large enough to be deer, or something deer-sized. In the center of the depression was a hole, maybe 2 feet across, perfectly round, descending at a sharp angle into darkness. The smell was coming from there. I crouched down, staying several feet back, trying to see how deep it went. The sides were smooth, almost polished, like something had worn them down through repeated passage. I picked up a small rock and tossed it in. It made no sound. I waited, counting seconds. 1, 2, 5, 10, nothing, like the hole just swallowed it without bothering to let it hit bottom. That's when I heard the breathing. It was coming from the hole, slow, deep, rhythmic, in and out. Except the exhale sounded wrong, too long, too wet, like something breathing through liquid. I stood up fast, stumbled backward. My boot caught on a root and I went down hard on my tailbone. The clipboard flew out of my hand and landed near the edge of the clearing. The breathing stopped. I sat there in the dirt, heart hammering, staring at that hole, waiting for something to emerge, but nothing did. The woods were completely silent now. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just that awful rotting smell and the sense that something was very, very close. I grabbed my clipboard and ran. Didn't look back, didn't try to be quiet, just crashed through the underbrush back toward the path. The hanging objects swayed as I passed. I felt them brush against my face and arms, cold and damp, but I didn't slow down. I burst out of the tree line and there was the woman, still standing in the exact same spot by the trailer. She didn't look surprised, just sad. "Told you not to go back there," she said. I got in the truck and locked the doors, started the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The woman was walking toward the path now, moving with purpose. And behind her, at the edge of the clearing, something pale and elongated was standing upright, watching me leave. I filed my report that night, marked the service call as complete, and never mentioned what I'd seen. 2 weeks later, I noticed that address had been removed from our service area. No explanation, just a note in the system that said property no longer serviced. See regional manager. I didn't ask questions, and when I quit that job 6 months later for something in Macon, I made sure my new route didn't go anywhere near Enigma. Sometimes I still think about that hole, though, about the way it swallowed sound, about what might have been down there breathing in the dark. Story 3. My grandmother used to tell stories about the woods outside Fitzgerald, back when she was young and that whole area was still mostly family farms and timber land. She'd talk about things her father had seen, things the old-timers would mention in passing and then refuse to discuss further. I never paid much attention, just kid stuff, ghost stories to make us behave. Then in August of 2018, my brother Wade called me about an opportunity. He'd been working in commercial real estate for a few years, and one of his clients was selling off parcels of undeveloped land in South Georgia. One piece in particular caught his eye, 40 acres outside Fitzgerald, mostly wooded with a small pond. The price was absurdly low. Wade thought we should go in together, hold it for a few years, then flip it to a hunting club or timber company. I was skeptical. I lived up in Athens and had no real interest in land speculation. But Wade was enthusiastic, and the numbers did look good. We closed on it in September. The seller seemed eager to finalize everything quickly, which should have been a warning sign, but at the time just felt like luck. We decided to visit the property on a Saturday in early October. Wade drove down from Atlanta, picked me up, and we headed south in his Tacoma. It was one of those perfect fall days, clear sky, temperature in the 70s, leaves just starting to turn. The property was accessible via a gravel logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. Wade's truck handled it fine, but we had to go slow, maneuvering around ruts and fallen branches. The entrance to our land was marked by 2 concrete posts with a chain across them. Wade had bolt cutters in the truck bed. The seller had mentioned the chain but hadn't provided a key. We cut through and drove in maybe half a mile until the road became impassable. Fallen tree blocking the way, too large to move. We'd have to walk from there. The woods were mostly pine with patches of hardwood, oak, sweet gum, a few hickories. The ground was carpeted with pine needles and last year's leaves, soft and springy underfoot. I could hear crows somewhere ahead, calling to each other in that harsh, rhythmic way they have. Wade had printed out a property survey map and was using his phone's GPS to navigate. We were heading toward the pond, which according to the survey was near the center of the property. The walk was pleasant at first, good weather, interesting terrain, that satisfying crunch of walking through untouched forest. About 20 minutes in, we found the first structure. It was a shed. Small, maybe 8 by 10, made of weathered wood so gray it almost looked silver. No windows, just a single door hanging half off its hinges. The roof had partially collapsed on one side. That wasn't on the survey, Wade said, checking his map. We approached cautiously. I'm not sure why we were cautious. There was obviously nothing dangerous about an abandoned shed, but something about it felt wrong. It was too isolated, too deliberately hidden in a small depression between 2 hills. The door was stuck. Wade had to kick it twice before it scraped inward, revealing darkness and that particular smell of rot and animal occupation. I used my phone light to look inside. Empty. Just bare dirt floor, sagging walls, and in one corner, a pile of what looked like rags. Except when I stepped closer, I realized they weren't rags. They were clothes, children's clothes. A yellow raincoat, a pair of small sneakers, a Disney princess backpack so faded I couldn't tell which princess it had been. Jesus, Wade muttered behind me. The clothes were arranged deliberately, not scattered like they'd been dumped. Laid out almost like a person might lie down. The shoes placed neatly at the bottom. The backpack positioned where a head would be. We should go, I said. My voice sounded strange in that confined space. Wade nodded. We backed out and he pulled the door shut, though it wouldn't stay closed properly. We should have left the property then. Gotten back in the truck and called someone, though who I'm not sure. But Wade had spent money on this land and some stubborn part of him wanted to at least see the pond before we left. We kept walking. The crows were louder now, and as we got closer I could see them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, perched in the trees ahead. All facing the same direction. All completely silent despite how many there were. The pond came into view through a gap in the trees. It was larger than I'd expected, maybe 2 acres, roughly oval. The water was dark and perfectly still, reflecting the sky like black glass. And around the entire perimeter, maybe 10 feet back from the water's edge, were posts. They were wooden stakes, each about 4 feet tall, driven into the ground at regular intervals. I counted them later and there were exactly 43. And mounted on top of each stake was a skull. Not all human, most looked like deer or dogs or other animals, but some, maybe 5 or 6, were unmistakably human. Bleached white by weather and time, empty eye sockets staring at the water. Wade grabbed my arm. I could feel him shaking. "We need to call someone," he said. "Police. We need to." He stopped because the crows had started moving. They lifted off the trees all at once, hundreds of them, rising in a black cloud that blotted out the sun for a moment. And they began circling the pond. Not flying away, just circling. Silent circles, perfect formation, like they were tethered to the water by invisible strings. And then something in the pond moved. It wasn't a splash or ripple. The water just displaced, bulging upward in the center, something beneath the surface pushing up without breaking through. Something large. Wade and I ran. We didn't talk about it, didn't plan it, just turned and crashed back through the woods the way we'd come. Branches whipped at my face. I slipped twice on wet leaves but kept going. Behind us I could hear the crows, still silent, still circling. We reached the truck and Wade got us out of there so fast he bottomed out the suspension twice on the logging road. Neither of us spoke until we were back on the highway. The next day, Wade called the sheriff's office in Ben Hill County and reported what we'd found. They sent someone out to investigate. The deputy called us back 3 days later and said they'd visited the property, found no evidence of human remains or illegal activity. The shed was empty, no clothes, no backpack. The pond had no posts around it, nothing but water and trees. Wade wanted to go back, prove we'd seen what we'd seen. I refused. We sold the property 2 months later, took a loss on it just to be done. The buyer was the same person who'd sold it to us. Last year, I was going through some of my grandmother's old photos after she passed, and I found one from the 1940s. A group of men standing by a pond, posing with fishing poles. The photo was labeled on the back in her handwriting. Daddy and his brothers at Crawford Pond, 1947. I recognized the tree line, the shape of the water, and in the background, barely visible, you could see them. Posts around the perimeter, skulls mounted on top. Whatever was there had been there for a very long time. Story 4. I moved to Dalonga in January of 2020 to take a job with the Forest Service. Administrative stuff mostly, permit processing, data entry, public inquiries. The office was in town, but I'd rented a small house about 5 miles north, right at the base of the mountains where the roads start getting steep and winding. It was perfect for what I needed. Quiet, private, close enough to work but far enough that I felt separated from everything. The house itself was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, ancient appliances, a wood stove I never figured out how to use properly. But it had a big screened porch that overlooked the woods, and that's where I spent most of my free time. The first few months were uneventful. I'd get home from work, make dinner, sit on the porch with a book or my laptop. Sometimes I'd see deer in the yard. Once, a black bear ambled through at dusk, completely unbothered by my presence. I loved it. Then sometime in late April, I think it was a Thursday, but I'm not certain, I started hearing the knocking. It would happen at night, always after dark. 3 slow knocks on the wall of the house, always the same rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. The first time I heard it, I assumed it was a branch hitting the siding, though there was no wind that night. I went outside with a flashlight and checked, but couldn't find any branches close enough to make contact. The knocking happened again 2 nights later. Same rhythm, same location, the back wall of the house near the bedroom. I checked again, found nothing. Started to wonder if it was pipes or the house settling, though I'd never heard it make that sound before. The third time it happened, I was on the porch. The knocking came from behind me, from inside the house. I went inside immediately, turning on all the lights, checking every room. Nothing. No one. All the doors and windows were locked from the inside. I called my landlord the next day, asked if there had been any issues with the house before I moved in. He seemed confused by the question, said no, everything was fine. Asked if I wanted him to come check it out. I said yes. He showed up that Saturday morning, walked around the property, inspected the walls, the roof, the foundation. Found nothing wrong. Told me old houses make noise, especially wooden ones, especially when the temperature changes. I nodded and thanked him, feeling foolish. But the knocking continued. Not every night, but frequently. Always 3 knocks, always slow and deliberate, and always from different locations, the back wall, the side wall, once from what sounded like directly under the floorboards of the living room. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie in bed listening, waiting for it. Sometimes it wouldn't come at all. Sometimes it would happen multiple times in one night, hours apart. Then in early May, I woke up around 3 in the morning and saw someone standing in my backyard. I sleep with the curtains open. I like being able to see outside, and the moon was bright enough that I could see clearly. There was a figure at the edge of the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the house. Tall and thin, wearing what looked like dark clothes, just standing there facing the house. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. Grabbed my phone off the nightstand. By the time I looked back, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Sat in the living room with all the lights on, checking the windows every few minutes. Nothing. But when dawn came and I finally worked up the courage to go outside, I found footprints in the soft dirt near where I'd seen the figure. Bare feet. Large. The prints led from the woods to a spot about 10 feet from the back door, then stopped. No prints leading back to the woods. None anywhere else in the yard. I took pictures with my phone. Considered calling the police, but didn't. What would I tell them? Someone stood in my yard. There's no law against that. The knocking became more frequent after that. Every night now, sometimes multiple times. And it started moving. I'd hear it on one wall, then seconds later on the opposite side of the house, like something was circling the building incredibly fast. I told myself I'd get used to it, that I'd find a rational explanation. But then something else started happening. I'd see movement through the windows, quick flashes in my peripheral vision, something passing by outside, too fast to focus on. When I turned to look directly, nothing would be there. But the sense of being watched was constant now, oppressive. One night in mid-May, I was on the porch reading when I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. Slow, crunching steps coming closer. I looked up but couldn't see anything. The porch light didn't reach that far. "Hello," I called out. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening. 30 seconds of silence. Then I heard my own voice call back from the darkness. "Hello." It was perfect. My exact tone, my exact inflection. Like a recording, except there was no way anyone could have recorded me just then. I went inside and locked the door. The knocking started immediately. 3 knocks on the back wall. then the side wall, then the front door, moving around the house in a circle, over and over, getting faster. I called my sister in Atlanta, told her I was coming to stay with her for a few days. She could hear the panic in my voice and didn't argue. I threw some clothes in a bag and left within 20 minutes, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I stayed in Atlanta for a week, told my work I had a family emergency, tried to convince myself I'd overreacted, that living alone in the woods had just made me paranoid. But when I came back, the house felt different, raw, like something had been inside while I was gone. Nothing was obviously disturbed, no broken windows, no forced doors, but small things were off. A chair in the kitchen was moved slightly. The book I'd been reading on the porch was now on the coffee table inside. The bathroom door was closed when I distinctly remembered leaving it open. That night the knocking didn't happen. Instead, I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of breathing. It was coming from the hallway, slow, deep breaths in and out. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the dark rectangle of my bedroom doorway. The breathing continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. In the morning, I found muddy footprints in the hallway, bare feet, same as the ones in the yard. They started at the front door and walked down the hall to my bedroom, where they stopped just outside my door. Then they turned and walked back out. The door had been locked. I was certain of it. I left that day. Didn't even pack everything. Just grabbed essentials and drove to Atlanta. Called my landlord from the road and told him I was breaking the lease. He tried to argue, threatened to keep my deposit. I told him to keep it, keep everything. I wasn't coming back. I never did go back. My sister and a friend drove up a month later to get my remaining belongings. They said the house looked fine, nothing strange. But when they were loading the last boxes into the truck, my sister swears she saw someone standing in the woods behind the house, watching them. Too tall to be a person, she said, and standing in a way that didn't look right. I live in Marietta now, in an apartment complex with neighbors on all sides. I keep the curtains closed at night, and sometimes, very rarely, I'll hear 3 slow knocks on my wall. I never answer. I never look. The story 5. The summer I turned 19, I worked for a landscaping company out of Columbus. It was miserable work, long hours in the heat, minimum wage, a boss who seemed personally offended by the concept of water breaks. But it was money, and I needed money for college in the fall. Most of our jobs were in subdivisions or commercial properties. Mowing, edging, mulching, mindless work. But in late July, we got contracted for something different, clearing brush on a rural property outside Junction City. The owner wanted trails cut through the woods for hunting season. It was me and 2 other guys, Terrell, who'd been with the company for years, and a new hire whose name I forgot. We drove out in the company truck on a Tuesday morning, following GPS to an address that kept trying to reroute us. The property was accessed via a dirt road so overgrown we had to go slow to avoid scraping the sides of the truck. The owner, an older man named Pettigrew, met us at a gate and gave Terrell the basic rundown. He wanted 3 trails cut, each about a 1/4 mile long, starting from different points around his property, and meeting at a clearing in the center where he planned to put a deer stand. Pettigrew was strange, polite enough but twitchy, kept looking over his shoulder at the woods while he talked. When Terrell asked if there was anything we needed to watch out for, wasp nests, poison ivy, terrain hazards, Pettigrew said yes but didn't elaborate, just, "Yes, watch out." He left us with a hand-drawn map and headed back to his house, which we could barely see through the trees. We got to work. The first trail was straightforward. Dense underbrush, but nothing we couldn't handle with machetes and a chainsaw for the larger stuff. We worked our way in slowly, cutting and clearing, marking trees to guide us back out. About an hour in, I found something odd. A circle of stones, maybe 3 feet in diameter, arranged on the ground. The stones were smooth and uniform like river rocks, though we were nowhere near water. In the center of the circle was a pile of sticks bundled together with what looked like black string. "Hey," I called to Terrell. "What's this?" He came over, looked at it for a few seconds, then shook his head. "Leave it alone. Keep cutting." "What is it?" "I don't know and I don't care. We're getting paid to clear brush, not ask questions." We moved on, but I noticed Terrell kept glancing back at the stone circle, and he gave it a wide berth when we passed it again on our way out. The second trail went faster. We'd gotten into a rhythm and the terrain was easier. No stone circles, no weird bundles, just trees and underbrush and the constant drone of cicadas. We stopped for lunch around noon, sitting in the truck bed with the AC running to cool off. The other guy, I really wish I could remember his name, mentioned he'd seen something strange while working, a shape in the trees watching him. He said it looked like a person at first, but when he looked directly at it, it was just a weird arrangement of branches and shadows. Terrell told him to stop spooking himself. But I noticed Terrell wasn't eating much, just picking at his sandwich and staring at the map Pettigrew had given us. The third trail was the worst. It led into the densest part of the woods, where the canopy was so thick it felt like dusk even though it was barely past 1 in the afternoon. The underbrush here was different too, thorny vines that caught on everything, tangled and aggressive. About 50 yards in, we found more stone circles, 3 of them this time, arranged in a triangle. Each one had a bundle in the center, but these bundles were larger, bound with what looked like hair. "This is messed up," the new guy said. His voice had gone thin and nervous. "Keep moving," Terrell said, but he sounded uneasy too. We pushed deeper. The cicadas had gone quiet here. The only sounds were our machetes cutting through vegetation and our boots on the leaf litter. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Then I heard humming. It was faint, barely audible, coming from somewhere ahead of us. A single note, sustained, rising and falling slightly. Not mechanical, definitely a human voice. We all stopped cutting and listened. "Someone's out here," the new guy whispered. Terrell didn't respond. He was staring ahead into the dimness, machete hanging loose in his hand. The humming stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, total silence. Then it started again, but from a different direction, behind us now. I turned around. The path we just cut was empty, but the underbrush on either side seemed darker than it should be, shadows that didn't match the available light. "Let's go back," I said. "We're not done," Terrell said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "I don't care, let's go back." The humming started again, closer now, and this time I could tell it was coming from multiple directions. Overlapping notes not quite in harmony, like several people all humming the same melody but slightly out of sync. The new guy dropped his machete and bolted, just turned and ran back down the trail, crashing through the brush in his panic. Terrell and I stood there for a second, frozen, and then we ran too. I don't remember the run clearly. Just branches whipping past, my lungs burning, the sound of Terrell's heavy breathing beside me. The humming followed us, always close, always just out of sight. We burst out of the tree line near where we'd parked the truck. The new guy was already there, leaning against the hood, gasping. His arms were scratched up from the thorns and his face was white. "Start the truck," he said to Terrell. "Start the fucking truck." Terrell fumbled with the keys. I looked back at the tree line at the gap where the trail led in. Something was standing there, tall and thin and motionless, partially hidden by shadow. I couldn't see details, no face, no features, just the outline of a human shape that was slightly wrong. The proportions off by just enough to make my skin crawl. Terrell got the truck started and we piled in. He didn't bother turning around properly, just threw it in reverse and back down the dirt road at speed, branches scraping both sides. We didn't talk, didn't stop, just drove straight back to the shop in Columbus. Terrell went into the office and came out 15 minutes later. Said he'd called Pettigrew, told him we couldn't complete the job. Pettigrew hadn't seemed surprised. I quit the next day. Found different work, something indoors. The new guy never came back. His final paycheck had to be mailed to him. 2 months later, I was scrolling through local news and saw a headline: "Body found on rural property near Junction City." The article was vague, just said hikers had discovered human remains in a wooded area. Police were investigating. I clicked through to see if there was more information. There wasn't much, but there was a photo of the property entrance and I recognized the gate, recognized the dirt road. The body was never identified. The case went cold. And as far as I know, Pettigrew still owns that land, and those trails still need cutting. No one's going back to finish them. Story 6. My cousin Bryn and I used to be close when we were kids. Same age, grew up in the same town. Waycross, spent summers together at our grandparents' place. Then life happened. She moved to Florida for college. I stayed in Georgia. We'd see each other at Christmas and that was about it. So when she called me in October of 2019 and asked if I wanted to go camping, I was surprised but said yes. It felt like a chance to reconnect, and I'd been meaning to spend more time outdoors anyway. She suggested a spot she'd found online, primitive camping near Homerville, on public land that allowed dispersed camping. No facilities, no other people, just us and the woods. Sounded perfect. We met that Saturday morning at a gas station off Highway 82. Bryn had driven up from Jacksonville in her Subaru, packed with more gear than we'd probably need. She seemed different from how I remembered, quieter, more intense. She'd always been the outgoing one, but now she barely made eye contact. "You okay?" I asked as we loaded my stuff into her car. "Fine, just tired, long drive." The camping spot was about 40 minutes down back roads that got progressively worse. We ended up parking at a trailhead and hiking in maybe 2 miles, looking for a good clearing. Bryn had a map printed from some camping forum, marked with coordinates for what was supposed to be a perfect campsite. We found the spot around noon. A natural clearing in a stand of pines, flat ground, close to a small creek. It really was perfect. Almost too perfect, like someone had deliberately cleared it at some point, though there was no evidence of structures or fire pits. We set up camp efficiently. 2 tents, a shared cooking area between them. Strung up a food bag to keep it away from animals. By early afternoon we were settled and Bryn suggested we hike the area a bit, see what was around. The woods were dense but navigable. We followed the creek for maybe half a mile, not talking much, just enjoying the movement and the silence. That's when we found the mannequin. It was sitting upright against a tree facing the creek, old-fashioned looking like a store display dummy from decades ago. Pale plastic, jointed limbs, featureless face. It was dressed in a stained men's suit that hung loose on the frame. "What the hell?" Bryn said. I walked closer. The mannequin was positioned deliberately, its legs crossed, hands folded in its lap. There was dirt in the creases of its joints and moss growing on one shoulder. It had been there a while. Maybe someone's art project, I suggested. Though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The placement was too remote, too hidden. Bryn didn't respond. She was staring at the mannequin's face, or where a face would be, the blank smoothness of it. "Let's keep moving," she said abruptly. We hiked for another hour, looping back toward camp. Didn't see any more mannequins, but we did find other things. A rusted shopping cart lying on its side in the middle of the woods, miles from any road. A child's bicycle with both tires missing, hanging from a branch. A single shoe women's high heel, placed upright on a stump like someone had just stepped out of it. None of it made sense. All of it felt deliberately arranged. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was setting. We made dinner over the camp stove. Nothing fancy, just ramen and canned chili, and tried to talk about normal things, family, work, anything but the weird objects in the woods. But as darkness fell, Bryn got quieter, kept looking past me into the trees like she was tracking something I couldn't see. "Did you hear that?" she asked at one point. "Hear what?" "Footsteps." I listened. Heard nothing but wind and the creek and the normal settling sounds of the forest at night. "I don't." "There," she interrupted, again. This time I heard it, soft crunching. Irregular intervals. Something moving through the underbrush, not trying to be quiet but not rushing either. We both stood up, grabbing our flashlights. I swept mine across the tree line but saw nothing except pine trunks and shadows. The footsteps stopped. "Probably a deer," I said. My voice sounded unconvincing even to me. Bryn shook her head. "Deer don't walk like that." We sat back down, but the mood was broken. We decided to turn in early, each retreating to our tents. I kept my flashlight and a can of bear spray beside my sleeping bag. Not that I thought it would help, but it made me feel slightly better. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Late, my phone said 2:47 a.m. Something had pulled me out of sleep, some sound or change in the environment. I lay there listening. At first, nothing. Then I heard Bryn whisper my name from her tent. "Luke, are you awake?" "Yeah," I whispered back. "There's someone outside." I held my breath and listened, and then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the camp, not trying to be stealthy, just walking in a wide circle around our tents over and over. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. Unzipped my tent flap just enough to peer out. The footsteps continued. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them clearly now, and there was something wrong with the rhythm. The steps were too evenly spaced, too mechanical, like someone counting out beats. "Should we say something?" Bryn whispered. She sounded terrified. "I don't know." The footsteps stopped, right between our tents. I could hear breathing now, slow, deep, wet sounding. Then a voice spoke. It was my grandfather's voice. He'd been dead for 6 years. "Lucas, come out here, boy." My blood went cold. It was perfect, his accent, his cadence, the way he'd always called me Lucas instead of Luke. But he was dead. This wasn't real. Don't respond, Bryn hissed. The voice spoke again. I know you can hear me. Neither of us moved. Seconds stretched into minutes. The breathing continued, patient and steady. Finally, the footsteps started again, moving away this time, heading toward the creek, fading gradually until they were gone. We waited until dawn before emerging from our tents. Neither of us had slept. When first light finally came, we packed up in silence, moving as quickly as possible. The campsite looked normal in daylight. No footprints, no signs anyone had been there. But as we were doing a final check, I noticed something. The mannequin we'd seen by the creek, it was now sitting at the edge of our clearing, 20 feet from Bryn's tent. Same position, legs crossed, hands folded, same blank face. We hadn't moved it, I know we hadn't. And there's no way someone could have carried it there without us hearing, not on that terrain. Bryn saw it too, looked at it for a long moment, then said, "Let's go." We didn't run, but we walked fast, made it back to the car in record time. As we pulled away, I looked in the side mirror. The mannequin was standing now, upright, arms at its sides, watching us leave. We drove in silence for 20 minutes before Bryn finally spoke. "I found this place on a forum," she said. "There were warnings in the comments, people saying not to camp there after dark. I thought they were joking." "Why did you pick it then?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely audible. "Because I wanted to see if the stories were true." I never asked what stories she meant. Didn't want to know. We haven't gone camping together since. Story 7. In the spring of 2017, I was dating someone who lived in a small town called Ranger, up near the Tennessee border. I'd drive up from Dalton every other weekend to visit. Ranger wasn't much, maybe 1,000 people, one stoplight, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. My girlfriend's name was Courtney. She rented a house on the edge of town, old but well-maintained, with a big yard that backed up to state forest. She loved that proximity to the woods. Said it made her feel less trapped in small-town Georgia. I'd been visiting for about 3 months when she mentioned something strange. She'd been hearing tapping on her bedroom window at night. Always the same pattern, 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more taps. She checked multiple times but never saw anything outside. I figured it was a branch, but when I inspected the area, there were no trees close enough to touch the window. No bushes, no vines, nothing. Probably a bird, I suggested. Pecking at its reflection. At 2 in the morning. She had a point. The first night I actually heard it myself was a Friday in May. We'd gone to bed around midnight. I was almost asleep when the tapping started. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I sat up and looked at the window. The curtains were drawn, but they were thin enough that I could see the silhouette of the window frame. Nothing moved outside. "See," Courtney whispered. "What is that?" I got up and pulled the curtain aside. The backyard was lit by a motion sensor light Courtney had installed. I could see the grass, the tree line beyond, nothing unusual. The tapping came again. But this time I was standing right next to the window and I could tell it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside, from the glass itself. I put my hand against the window pane. It was ice cold, and as I touched it, the tapping stopped. "Did you feel that?" I asked. "Feel what?" "The window, it's freezing." She came over and touched it. Pulled her hand back immediately. "Jesus, why is it so cold?" We cranked up the heat and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. kept thinking about that cold glass and the sound that seemed to come from nowhere. The next morning, I noticed something I'd missed in the dark. There were smudges on the window, fingerprints on the inside, dozens of them overlapping like someone had pressed their hands against the glass repeatedly. "Did you clean this window recently?" I asked Courtney. "Last week." "Why?" I showed her the prints. Her face went pale. "Those weren't there yesterday," she said. "We spent that Saturday trying to rationalize it. Maybe the prints had always been there and we just hadn't noticed. Maybe condensation made them visible, but neither explanation felt right." That night the tapping started earlier, around 10 p.m. before we'd even tried to sleep. Same pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. This time I was ready. I positioned my phone on the nightstand, camera open. When the tapping started, I aimed it at the window and started recording. The curtains were open now. We'd left them that way deliberately. I watched the window while recording, nothing visible. But in the video, when I played it back later, you could see something. A shadow. Not outside the window. Inside. On the glass itself, like it was embedded in it. The shape of a hand, fingers spread. And as the tapping occurred, the shadow moved slightly, like the hand was pressing harder. "Show me," Courtney said. I did. She watched it twice, then said, "I want to leave. It's 10 at night. I don't care, I want to go to your place, now." We packed overnight bags and left. I tried to convince her we were overreacting, but honestly I was relieved to go. We stayed at my apartment in Dalton that weekend. On Monday, Courtney called her landlord and said she was breaking her lease. He argued, threatened to keep her deposit. She told him to keep it, she wasn't coming back. She stayed with me for a few weeks while looking for a new place. During that time, she kept having nightmares. She'd wake up around 2 a.m. gasping, saying she dreamed about her old house, about something trying to get in. Eventually, she found a new rental, a duplex in Dalton. Safe, well-lit, no woods nearby. We moved her stuff in and tried to move on. But about a month later, I was at her new place when I heard it. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. I was in the living room. Courtney was in the kitchen. The tapping was coming from the front window. I looked at Courtney. Her face had gone white. "No," she whispered. I went to the window, pulled back the curtain. Nothing outside, but the glass was cold. And there were fingerprints on the inside, fresh ones. That night, Courtney packed a bag and drove to her parents' house in Chattanooga. She asked me not to come with her, said she needed to figure things out alone. I didn't hear from her for 3 days. When she finally called, she sounded exhausted. "It followed me," she said, "to my parents' house. The tapping, the cold window, it's still here." "That's impossible." "I know, but it's happening." She stayed at her parents for 2 weeks. The tapping occurred every night. Her father checked everything, the windows, the roof, the exterior walls, found nothing wrong, but the tapping continued. Eventually, Courtney checked herself into a hotel, then another hotel. Then she drove to Florida, stayed with a friend. The tapping followed her to every location. She started seeing a therapist, got prescribed medication for anxiety. The therapist suggested it was psychological trauma manifesting as auditory hallucinations. Maybe, but I've seen the videos. I felt that cold glass, and I remember the last time I saw her before she moved to Florida permanently. We met for coffee in Dalton and she showed me her hands. Her fingertips were pale. Not bruised exactly, but discolored. like they'd been pressed against something very cold for a very long time. "I can still feel it," she said. "The glass, like I'm always touching it." We don't talk much anymore. She's living somewhere outside Tampa now, as far from the Georgia mountains as she could get. Last I heard, the tapping had stopped, but she still sleeps with the lights on and she won't go near windows after dark. I drove past her old house in Ranger once about a year later. Someone else was renting it. The lights were on, curtains open, and I swear, for just a second I saw a shadow on the bedroom window. The shape of a hand, fingers spread, pressing against the glass from the inside. A story 8. I spent most of 2016 working odd jobs around South Georgia, never staying in one place too long. One of those jobs was with a guy named Randall who did property maintenance, mowing, repairs, junk removal, whatever people needed. He paid cash and didn't ask questions, which suited me fine at the time. In November, we got hired to clear out a house outside Moultrie. Estate sale situation. The owner had died. Family wanted everything removed before selling the property. Randall quoted them a flat rate and we scheduled it for a Saturday. The house was old. I mean really old, probably built in the 20s or 30s, set back from the road on about 5 acres. White paint peeling, shutters hanging crooked, porch sagging in the middle, but structurally sound, just neglected. The family had left us a key in the mailbox and said to leave it under the mat when we finished. They didn't want to be there while we worked. Randall said that was common. People don't like watching strangers go through their dead relatives' belongings. We started in the living room. Furniture, boxes, old newspapers, the usual accumulation of decades. Randall had a system, sort everything into keep, donate, or trash. The family would go through the keep pile later. Everything else was our problem. The house felt wrong from the start, not in an obvious way, just off. The air was stale and too cold, even though the heat was supposedly still on. And sounds echoed weirdly, our footsteps, our voices, like the rooms were larger than they appeared. We worked through the morning without incident, cleared the living room and most of the kitchen. Randall sent me to start on the bedrooms while he dealt with the larger furniture. There were 3 bedrooms. 2 were normal beds, dressers, cluttered closets, but the 3rd bedroom was locked. I tried the handle several times, checked for a key on the door frame. Nothing. I went back to ask Randall. "Door's locked," I told him, "so pick it." "Pick it." "We're clearing the whole house. That includes locked rooms. You got a credit card?" I jimmied the lock with my license. Took about 30 seconds of wiggling before something gave and the door swung open. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing. Just bare walls, bare floor, and a bare window with no curtains, except the walls were covered in writing, not painted or drawn, carved, scratched into the plaster with something sharp. Words, sentences, symbols I didn't recognize, covering every surface from floor to ceiling. Some of it was legible, names, dates, phrases. Most of it was just frantic scratching, layers upon layers, like someone had spent years clawing at the walls. I stepped inside slowly. The air in here was even colder, cold enough that I could see my breath. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, burnt hair. I moved closer to the wall, trying to read some of the carved words. Most were nonsensical or incomplete, but one phrase was repeated over and over, in different spots, different handwriting. "It watches from the attic." I looked up. The ceiling was bare except for a small access panel in one corner. A pull string hung down from it. "Hey, Randall," I called. My voice sounded muffled in that room, like the walls were absorbing it. No response. I walked back to the door and called again, louder this time. "Randall." Still nothing. I could hear sounds from elsewhere in the house, thuds, scraping, the normal sounds of furniture being moved. He was definitely still here, but he couldn't hear me or wasn't responding. I turned back to the room. The pull string for the attic access was swaying slightly, even though there was no air movement. Just a gentle back and forth motion, like someone had touched it and walked away. I should have left. Should have walked out and told Randall I wasn't going in that room. But something about those carved words bothered me. The repetition, the desperation in them. I reached up and pulled the string. The attic panel swung down with a creak and a folded ladder descended. Old wood coated in dust. The opening above was dark. I couldn't see anything beyond the first few feet. "Hello," I called up. Felt stupid immediately. What was I expecting? Someone to answer? But something did answer. Not a voice. A sound, like something large shifting position, floorboards creaking under weight. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointed it up into the opening. For a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Then my brain caught up and my stomach dropped. There was a face looking back at me, pale, elongated, eyes too large and too far apart. Mouth hanging open, jaw unhinged like a snake's. And it was smiling. Not a human smile, too wide, too many teeth. It lunged. I threw myself backward, hit the floor hard. Something grabbed at my ankle fingers, too many fingers, cold and dry like paper. But I kicked free and scrambled out of the room. Slammed the door behind me. I ran through the house, yelling for Randall. Found him in the living room loading boxes into his truck. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "We're not done." "I don't care, we're leaving." I must have looked serious because he didn't argue. Just tossed the last box in the truck and got in. I climbed in the passenger side, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the seatbelt fastened. As we pulled away, I looked back at the house. The third bedroom window, the one that had been empty, now had something in it. A silhouette, tall and thin and motionless, watching us leave. Randall followed my gaze, saw it too. He didn't say anything, just drove faster. When we got back to town, he handed me my cut of the payment and said he'd finish the job himself later. We both knew he wouldn't. I never went back to Moultrie. Never asked Randall if he ever returned to that house. Didn't want to know. But I did look up the property later out of morbid curiosity. Found the listing online. The house sold within a month, bought by an investor for cash. Demolished 6 weeks later. The listing photos showed the exterior, the yard, the porch. But in one photo, a shot of the front of the house, you could see the third bedroom window, and there was something in it. Blurred, barely visible, but unmistakably there. A pale face pressed against the glass, smiling. Story 9. The last year I worked for the Postal Service, I had a rural route outside Statesboro. Mostly farm country, long driveways, mailboxes spaced half a mile apart. Peaceful work. I'd listen to podcasts and just drive, dropping off packages and letters, rarely seeing anyone. One of my stops was a property about 15 miles out from town at the end of a long gravel road. The mailbox said Covington in faded letters. I'd been delivering there for months and had never seen anyone, just left packages on the porch and moved on. Then in March of 2018, I got a package too large for the mailbox. Required a signature. I'd have to go to the door. I drove down the gravel road, which was longer than I'd expected, maybe half a mile through pine woods before the house came into view. It was a modest ranch-style place, well kept, with a neat lawn and a flower bed out front. Normal, except for one thing. Every window was covered, not with curtains, with boards. Plywood nailed over the frames from the outside. Every single window, first floor and second floor, completely covered. I parked and grabbed the package. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed other details. The flower bed was full of dead plants. The grass, though mowed, had patches of bare dirt like something had burned it. And there were symbols drawn in chalk on the concrete porch, circles and lines and shapes I didn't recognize. I rang the doorbell, heard it chime inside, then nothing. I waited maybe 30 seconds and rang again. This time I heard movement, slow footsteps approaching the door. It opened a crack, chain lock engaged. An eye appeared in the gap. Female, middle-aged, bloodshot. "Package for Covington," I said, holding it up. "Leave it," the voice said, hoarse, like she hadn't used it in a while. "Need a signature, ma'am." Silence. The eye just stared at me, then slid the clipboard through. I hesitated. This was unusual, but not technically against protocol. I slid the clipboard through the gap, heard her fumble with it, then it came back with a scrawled signature. "Have a good day," I said, and left the package on the porch. As I walked back to my truck, I heard her voice again, barely audible. "Don't come back after dark." I turned around. The door was already closed. For the next few months, deliveries to that address were normal, well, normal for that property. Packages left on the porch, no signature required, no interaction. I tried to schedule that stop for midday just because the boarded windows unnerved me. Then in June, I got assigned a rare evening shift. Summer hours extended to accommodate package volume. My route would run until about 7 p.m., which meant some stops would be in twilight. The Covington property was scheduled for 6:45. Last stop on my route. I almost skipped it. The package wasn't critical, just a book from Amazon. But I was trying to maintain a perfect delivery record, and skipping stops looked bad on reports. I drove down the gravel road as the sun was setting. The woods were darker than I remembered, shadows stretching long across the road. When I reached the house, it looked worse in the dim light. The boarded windows gave it the appearance of a skull, empty eye sockets, blind and waiting. I grabbed the package and walked to the door quickly. Wanted to be in and out. I placed it on the porch and was turning to leave when I heard the sound. Scratching. Coming from inside the house. Not like fingernails on wood, more aggressive than that. Like something with claws scraping at the walls from the inside. I froze. The scratching continued, moving, starting from one side of the house, traveling along the wall, circling around toward where I stood. The front door was still closed, but I could hear the scratching right behind it now, inches away. Frantic and rhythmic, like whatever was making it was trying to dig through. Then it stopped. In the silence, I heard breathing. On the other side of the door, heavy, labored, wet, I ran to my truck. Didn't look back, didn't lock up the package, just got in and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The front door was open now, and something was standing in the doorway. Too tall to be the woman I'd spoken to, too thin. Its silhouette was wrong, limbs bent at angles that didn't make sense. I drove faster than I should have on that gravel road. Reported the delivery as complete and never mentioned what I'd seen. The next day, my supervisor called me into the office, said there'd been a complaint. The Covington address claimed they never received their package, and there was evidence I'd left early. My truck's GPS showed I'd spent less than 30 seconds at the property. I tried to explain but couldn't find the right words. Eventually just said I felt unsafe and left. My supervisor reassigned that stop to someone else, a newer carrier named Jessica. I wanted to warn her but didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound insane. Jessica did the route for 2 weeks. Then she requested a transfer. When I asked her why, she just shook her head. "That Covington place," she said. "Something's not right there." What happened? I don't want to talk about it, but I'm not going back. The property was eventually marked as delivery unavailable, unsafe conditions. I don't know what happened to the woman who lived there. The house is still on the route maps, still technically an active address. But no one delivers there anymore. And if you drive past at night, which I did once against my better judgment, you can see lights inside. Not from windows since they're all boarded up, but seeping through the cracks. Flickering, unsteady lights like candles or fires. And if you stop and listen, you can hear the scratching. Constant, methodical, like something inside has been trying to dig its way out for years. Story 10. I inherited my uncle's cabin outside Blue Ridge in the fall of 2022. We hadn't been close. He was my father's brother, estranged from the family for reasons no one fully explained. When he died, I was surprised to learn he'd left the property to me. The lawyer handling the estate said it was about 12 acres with a small cabin, off-grid but habitable. Worth money if I wanted to sell it. I drove up from Atlanta on a Saturday in October to assess it. The cabin was harder to find than the directions suggested. GPS kept trying to reroute me, and the final mile was a rutted dirt track that made me nervous about the car's suspension. But eventually I found it, a small log structure in a clearing, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It was better maintained than I'd expected. The roof looked solid, the porch was intact, and there was a neat stack of firewood under a tarp. My uncle had been here recently, or someone had. The door wasn't locked. Inside was simple but clean. One main room with a kitchenette, a wood stove, a single bed, a bookshelf full of paperbacks, a table with 2 chairs, normal, almost cozy. I spent the afternoon exploring the property. There was a creek about 100 yards from the cabin, a small shed with tools and supplies, and several overgrown trails leading into the woods. Nothing unusual. As evening approached, I decided to stay the night. I had a sleeping bag in the car, and there was something appealing about spending a night in my newly inherited property. Plus, it would give me a better sense of whether this was a place I'd actually want to keep. I built a fire in the wood stove, made dinner from supplies in my cooler, and settled in with one of my uncle's books. The cabin was comfortable, warm. The only sounds were the fire crackling and the wind in the trees outside. Around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Not trying to be quiet, just slow, deliberate steps. Walking from one end of the porch to the other, then back, I set down the book and listened. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth. "Hello," I called out. The footsteps stopped. I waited for a response. None came. After maybe 30 seconds, the footsteps resumed. Same pattern, end to end, turn back again. I got up and went to the door, considered opening it, but something stopped me. Instead, I looked out the window beside the door. The porch was empty, but I could still hear the footsteps, clear as anything, right outside. Wood creaking under weight, but nothing visible. I backed away from the door. The footsteps continued for another minute, then stopped. Silence returned. I tried to rationalize it. Old wood settling, thermal contraction, something, but I'd heard footsteps, distinct, rhythmic, impossible to mistake. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small sound made me alert. Around 2 a.m. I heard the footsteps again. This time on the roof. Walking from the front to the back of the cabin, slow and deliberate. When dawn finally came, I packed up quickly. Checked the roof from the ground. No footprints in the dust coating the shingles, no marks at all. I drove back to Atlanta and tried to decide what to do with the property. Part of me wanted to sell it immediately. Part of me thought I'd overreacted, let an unfamiliar environment spook me. 2 weeks later, I hired a local contractor to do an inspection, get an assessment of the cabin's condition for insurance purposes. He called me a few days after visiting. "Interesting place," he said. "Your uncle do a lot of the work himself." "I don't know. Why?" "Well, it's solid, but there's some weird additions. Like someone reinforced all the doors and windows. Heavy-duty locks, metal bars, and there's symbols carved into the door frames. Religious stuff, maybe. I'm not sure." "Symbols?" "Yeah, and the shed. Did you look inside carefully?" "Just glanced in. There's a cot in there. Looks like someone was sleeping in it regularly. Your uncle, maybe." "Why would he sleep in the shed when there's a cabin?" Silence, then, "Good question." I drove back up the following weekend, this time with a friend named Marcus. I didn't tell him about the footsteps, just said I needed help clearing out the cabin. We arrived midday. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it, but the shed door was open. I'd closed it last time. I was sure of it. Marcus and I walked over. Inside, the cot was covered with blankets and a pillow, and on the wall above it, carved into the wood, was a message. "Safer here than inside." Marcus looked at me. "Your uncle wrote this." "I guess. Why would it be safer in a shed?" I didn't answer, because I was looking at the cabin now, really looking at it, and I noticed something I'd missed before. Scratches around the door frame. Long, deep gouges, like something had tried to force its way in. From the outside. That night, Marcus wanted to leave. Said the place gave him bad vibes. I agreed, but we'd come all this way and I wanted to at least sort through my uncle's belongings before we left. We worked quickly, boxing up books and clothes and personal items. As the sun set, we loaded everything into my car. The plan was to drive back that night, but as we were finishing, Marcus found something under the bed. A journal, leather-bound, filled with handwriting. I opened it. The entries were dated, starting about 5 years ago. My uncle's writing, I assumed. Most of it was mundane, notes about repairs, observations about weather, lists of supplies. But the last few entries were different. One from about 6 months before he died. "It walks at night now. Used to just be sounds. Now I see it. Too tall, doesn't move right." Another from a few weeks later. "Tried to leave, made it to the road. It was waiting there, had to come back." The final entry dated just days before his death. "It's learned to mimic my voice." I hear myself calling from the woods. Don't answer. Don't go outside after dark. Stay in the shed if it gets in the cabin. Marcus read over my shoulder. When he finished, he said, "We're leaving right now." I agreed. We got in the car and started down the dirt track. It was fully dark now and my headlights barely cut through the shadows. Halfway to the main road, we saw someone standing in the middle of the track. I slammed on the brakes. The figure was illuminated in the headlights, tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like my uncle's clothes. But the proportions were wrong. Arms too long. Head tilted at an angle that looked broken. It stood there for maybe 5 seconds. Then it smiled, not a human smile, something wider and more deliberate, and stepped off the track into the woods. We sat frozen, I don't know how long. Finally Marcus whispered, "Drive." I drove, didn't stop until we hit the highway, didn't look back. I listed the property for sale the next week. Priced it low, accepted the first offer. I've never been back to Blue Ridge, but sometimes I think about my uncle, about him spending his last years in that cabin, trapped by something he couldn't escape, something that's still there, waiting in those woods. The new owners took possession last month. I hope they're okay, but I suspect eventually they'll learn what my uncle learned. Some places don't want you to leave. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.